Hello, everyone, and welcome to our associates meeting with Phil Swagel, the head of the Congressional Budget Office. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and I'm really grateful that you can all join us today for what I know will be a really interesting and very topical conversation. It's truly an honor to have Phil with us today. As director of the CBO, he has an enormous amount of responsibility on his plate, especially nowadays, as lawmakers and the general public are waiting for his agency to put a true price tag on the social spending bill known as Build Back Better that Democrats are trying to move through Congress. As Phil just wrote earlier this week on the CBO's website, the analysis of the bill's many provisions is complicated, and CBO will provide a cost estimate for the entire bill as soon as practicable. While we're all eager for the CBO's analysis, this thoroughness really goes to the very purpose of the work they're responsible for. The CBO is a nonpartisan agency that produces independent analyses of various bills and legislative proposals, and they produce dozens of cost estimates each year, along with reports that deepen our understanding about the economic situation here in the US and the effects of previous or potential future policies. Their mission very neatly aligns with the work we support here at SIEPR that looks very closely at the benefits and the consequences of various economic policies. I'm proud to admit that CBO.gov is one of my most frequent sources of data and research. I frequently cite CBO in my academic and my more general audience writing. And I'm so proud that some of my former advisees and other students work there or have previously served at CBO. And not only is Phil with us today to offer his insights into the budgetary process through the pandemic, he's also been incredibly generous with his time by meeting with several SIEPR faculty affiliates. And I'm even more grateful for the time that he took earlier today to speak with a group of about 70 students in our orbit over lunch here at SIEPR. We're very committed to inspiring the up-and-coming generation of aspiring economists and others with economic policy interests and preparing them for what a career in academia or in public service might look like. I know that getting to meet with the CBO director is a tremendous opportunity for every one of them. I actually first met Phil when he was serving more than 15 years ago as a chief of staff at the Council of Economic Advisors, and subsequently as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the US Treasury Department in the George W. Bush administration. While there, he was responsible for analysis of a wide range of economic issues, including policies relating to the financial crisis and the Troubled Asset Relief Program during the Bush administration. After that service, we became colleagues when he joined the University of Maryland School of Public Policy as a professor. He also has taught at Northwestern, the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and at Georgetown. His academic research has focused on financial market reform, international trade policy, and China's role in the global economy, and he's been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the Milken Institute. In addition to his academic appointments and his service at CEA and Treasury, Phil was also an economist at the Federal Reserve Board and at the International Monetary Fund. So he's served in quite a few important positions over his career. He earned his Ph.D. in economics from Harvard and his bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton. With that, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Phil Swagel to SIEPR. And if you have questions for Phil at any point, you can submit them through the link on your screens, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. So Phil will present for a bit. I'll ask him a few questions, open it up for questions from all of you, but feel free to send in your questions anytime so that we can have access to them. And again, Phil, thank you so much for spending time with us here today. And I'm going to let you take it away now.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone watching. And I'm sorry only that we're not able to do this in person and hope to do that in the future. And I'll just add to what Mark said is that it is really a pleasure to meet with so many undergraduates who are interested in policy and thinking about the future. And in some ways, it's a hopeful sign that, a bunch of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are thinking about how to serve the country through economic policy. So I was grateful and glad to see that. So I'm going to, let's see if I'm going to share some slides here. Good. Hopefully everyone can see slides now. And I'm going to talk about CBO's work during the pandemic and our budget and economic analysis during the pandemic. And I should start by just saying that a little bit about the CBO and our role where we fit in. And obviously, given what's happening in the news and in policy considerations, CBO is kind of front and center right now it's more normal for us to be, more the back office, one might say. We support the Congress, right? The agency is nonpartisan, and we provide technical assistance to policymakers and then provide cost estimates. And nonpartisan, this is something that was put in at CBO in the very beginning of the agency by Alice Rivlin, the founder of the agency 46 years ago. And the key to that is that the agency does not put forward policy recommendations. So we don't provide, we don't provide our opinion. We don't tell policymakers do this, or this is the right thing, or this is the wrong thing. We provide analysis of the costs of the behavioral implications of policies, and it's up to policymakers to decide what to do. And so is really firmly in the DNA of the agency, the nonpartisanship. And of course, we're working on the cost estimate, as Mark said, of the Build Back Better legislation that came out of the House. And I'm happy to talk about that in questions. If you go to the CBO website, you can see we've started to put forward the first several pieces of that estimate. We're essentially doing it a title at a time of the legislation. As it's ready, we're posting those on our website. And so several of those titles are there already. Okay. And again, I'm going to focus here, for maybe 20 minutes or so on CBO's work during the pandemic. And my purpose is to provide some information on our process and how we go about analyzing the economy and legislation, and hopefully that will provide some insight, maybe including for the current situation. All right. So good. So here the slide that you can see hopefully provides the big picture budgetary numbers on the first four pieces of legislation that were enacted toward the beginning of the pandemic, responding to the economic situation arising from the pandemic. And you can see these varied in size, with the CARES Act enacted in March being over $1.7 trillion. So there's a total in 2020 of $3.3 trillion across 5 bills. And I'm just going to flip to the next slide and show you here the Appropriations Act enacted at the end of 2020, and then the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 that was enacted earlier this year. So it's $3.3 trillion in total in 2020. That was across 5 bills. And then, as you can see on the screen, nearly $1.9 trillion further in the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, in March. And CBO was involved in all of these, first providing technical assistance to policymakers and staff as they develop the legislation, and then later in providing the cost estimate. So let me just think about a broad point with the pandemic, and show you sort of an overview of where I'm going. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think it's fair to say that the focus of policymakers in providing assistance was getting the assistance out quickly. And there's a concern about demand as the economy shut down last March, and that was the policymaking imperative. And so the considerations of sort of incentives, of efficiency, the efficiency of policy, of targeting, certainly considerations of deficits and debt, bang for the buck, certainly we're there, and those are considerations always on policymakers' mind, but certainly much less than than would be the case in in other circumstances. And as you can imagine, I'll come back to this later, when I get to the end here, to talk about this situation now, and then look forward ahead. So let me start by thinking about some of the legislation, and I'll start with our health analysis. And it's not surprising, of course, that healthcare policy figured prominently given the pandemic, just the nature of the pandemic. And so what I've put on the screen here then is the early some of the provisions early in the pandemic. And you see there's money, as you might expect, for a variety of healthcare provisions, CDC, NIH, FDA, the whole alphabet soup federal agencies responding to the pandemic on the health side. And then at the bottom is telehealth. So this is what we estimated about $500 million in cost for Medicare. And so I'm going to hold up my phone. And in some sense, today, let's see, get into the camera here. Of course, today, if any of us want to see telehealth, well, we pick up our phone and we look in the camera, and a doctor, or PA, or some other medical professional gets on the other end and provides us, some services. That's today. Before the pandemic, for Medicare beneficiaries to receive telehealth, they actually had to go to a specified telehealth center to receive services. And since the world has changed since the pandemic, what one of the early COVID-related bills did was it waived that and allowed people to receive telehealth services, Medicare beneficiaries to receive telehealth services without those requirements. Now, for how long? It did it for the duration of the public health emergency. So the public health emergency was declared at the end of January, so before the economy shut down, but at the end of January, and that enabled certain flexibilities within the federal government. But that's how long this Medicare waiver at that time was going to take place, was going to last. Okay. Then later legislation, the Families First Act, enacted in March, provided other benefits related to the pandemic, including the share of expenditures for Medicaid covered by the federal government was increased. So this is a way of providing federal resources for states. And that was increased, again, temporarily for the duration of the public health emergency. There are some other provisions, but hopefully you understand the point that federal assistance, federal resources, the amount depended on the duration of the public health emergency. So from the CBO perspective, for us to say, well, how much is this going to cost for us to project that? Well, that meant we had to project, well, how long is the public health emergency going to last? And of course, it feels like a million years ago, but back last March, this was sort of, 2 weeks to bend the curve or lower the curve. It's hard to remember what it was, but that was the time, sort of people expected this to be kind of a short-term thing. We had no idea, no more idea than anyone else. So within CBO, we constituted a virus team that had to develop analysis, both on the contours of the pandemic, how long would it last, and then to think through the healthcare impacts. So the federal government eventually covered, a variety of costs of the healthcare provided. So we had to know, well, how many people would be hospitalized? How many cases would there be? How many people hospitalized? The people in the hospital, how many would go into the ICU? How many would die? And so on, because all that flowed back to the federal budget. The virus team is in CBO. So again, this is an illustration of how we work. First set out all the avenues by which the pandemic might affect the federal budget. And I'm not going to go into each such avenue, but we'll just say there are many ways in which healthcare costs flow back to the federal government. So we had to set them out and then say, okay, each provision of legislation affecting health that depended on the duration of the public health emergency, what do we expect? And then go forward and try to figure it out. And consulting widely in the US with other federal agencies, with researchers in the US, around the globe. I didn't know there was such a thing as a computational epidemiologist, but it turns out there's a US national laboratory that has a whole really super team of them and others. So the CBO virus team this was in April of 2020, so near the beginning of the pandemic, came up with a projection. I'm not going to go into all the details of the methodology, but ended up with a projection of 500,000 deaths through the end of 2021. Now, this is, again, at the beginning of the pandemic. Things are bad in New York, but as a nation, we weren't testing. We really had no, a modest sense of the scope of the pandemic. And I have to admit, I was pretty stunned by that prediction of 500,000 deaths. Now, obviously, we've way past that, where we're over 750,000. In a sense, the last 250,000 have come after the widespread availability of vaccination, which of course is a tragedy all of its own. But that's the sort of that's sort of work that CBO does in trying to figure out the cost of legislation. And actually, I should say also that our projection is that the public health emergency lasts through the middle of 2022, so through the end of June, July 1st, 2022. And so what does it mean for legislation? Well, if there's legislation that obviously is enacted, signed by the president, that ends the public health emergency early, well, that would be scored as the vernacular as saving money, because relative to current law, relative to what we have under current law, that would involve less federal spending. If the pandemic lasts longer, if the public health emergency lasts longer, well, we will note that and take that into account in our next budget projections. Let me talk a little bit more about health. And again, just think about one other aspect of our analysis during the pandemic relating to healthcare. And so this is a slide from our 2020 report on insurance coverage, and it's looking at the effect of the pandemic on health insurance coverage. And of course, so many tragedies in the pandemic, obviously the sickness and death, the educational loss, job loss. So what this looks at is the job loss on the left-hand side of your screen, if I've got this right, depending on the mirroring that you're all seeing. And then what does it mean for insurance coverage? And what's striking about this chart is how different the pandemic was from past recessions. And of course, I think we all understand the health effects of the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic were very heavily skewed toward people at the bottom of the income distribution, and that had an implication for what was happening in health insurance. So on the left-hand side in the pie chart, you can see on average about 14.3 million people lost their jobs in 2020. And that's, and again, there's many people part-time, so this is trying to translate that into full-time coverage. And then look at the bottom right, well, the number of uninsured that we projected, the increase in the number of uninsured that we projected is only 1.3 million. So it's, it's really a striking disparity, over 14 million people losing their jobs, but the increase in the number of uninsured rising by only 1.3 million. So what was happening? There's two factors here. One is on the left hand, the lighter blue part of the pie chart, you can see that many of the people who lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic did not have health insurance through their job, did not have an offer of employment-based insurance, which of course is a characteristic of relatively lower paying jobs. So that's one, and again, illustrating the skewed nature of the pandemic. And then two, of the people who did have an offer of employment-based jobs, this is the right-hand side of the of the pie chart, you see, well, about 3.3 million had just a temporary job loss and then went back and continued their health coverage. And of the 3.9 million of the permanent job loss, 1.1 were projected to have health insurance through some other employment-based system. So it could be through COBA, the continuing coverage, could be through a spouse or a parent. People shifted onto Medicaid or CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. People shifted onto the ACA, the health insurance programs generally provided through the exchanges set up by the Affordable Care Act, leaving 1.3 million uninsured. Now, it's a huge number, right? This is a huge number of people and a huge hardship. In a pandemic with so many hardships and so much dislocation, 1.3 million additional people losing health insurance, becoming uninsured, is a huge number. Relative to the size of the job loss, though, it's striking at how much less it was. And again, just illustrating how different of a recession this was. That there is research toward the beginning of the pandemic that had this had been a kind of typical recession, the loss of insurance coverage, given the scope of job loss, would have been something like 5 to 10 million. And so again, this matters a lot for CBO because of the budgetary impacts. And this is the kind of analysis that CBO we have to do to figure out, well, what's the economic situation, what's the healthcare situation, and then go from there into the budgetary situation. We are looking ahead, and so this slide shows you the agenda from the meeting of our panel of health advisors that was held earlier this fall in September, and we are looking at the long-term effects of the pandemic on healthcare spending. Will healthcare spending come back? There's lots of foregone care, and then looking ahead at what does it mean for distribution. I think we all understand there's many disparities in our healthcare system, and then looking ahead to say, well, what is the impact of the advent of telehealth on the future healthcare system? So what does it mean for for people, for their health? What does it mean for the federal budget and for spending? So and at the very bottom you see the meeting also looked at the effect of changes in drug prices, legislation that affects drug prices. What does that mean for the innovation in the pharmaceutical industry? And of course, that's an issue that continues, including with our analysis of the Build Back Better Act. Okay, so I have other slides I'm going to skip ahead just because I want to leave lots of room for questions and discussion. So I'm going to essentially skip through the macro analysis rather than going through it. This is analysis of the effects of the various provisions on the economy and infrastructure and so on. And let me just talk quickly about what we are thinking about now. And so we are looking ahead and thinking about the impacts of the pandemic. And of course, there can be many economic impacts. And so I've listed just a few of them. Well, what does the pandemic mean for productivity? Well, of course, we're all here, watching this on, streaming on YouTube or on Zoom. And, like other organizations, CBO has been working, largely virtual during the pandemic. And, Congress has been a mix of virtual and hybrid. We've been able to fulfill our mission thanks to the technology, including this virtual technology. And we're trying to think about, what does this mean for the future? What does it mean for productivity? What does it mean for growth? What does it mean for incomes, for job creation? And then, of course, what does it mean for the federal budget and for revenues? We're thinking hard about labor force participation. There's millions of Americans who left the labor force during the pandemic. Millions are still out of the labor force. There's a mix of older Americans and then parents, largely moms, largely mothers. And we're thinking carefully about what happens and do they come back. I mentioned mortality and fertility and demographic parameters are incredibly important for the federal budget. Thinking over the long-term budget horizon about the effects of mortality and fertility on Social Security, on healthcare spending, and so on. Fertility declined. This is not a surprise. Fertility declined at the beginning of the pandemic, and the question is whether it will come back. Now, after the financial crisis, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, as Mark said, I was at the Treasury Department, fertility declined as a result of the financial crisis, and that did not return. And so we are looking carefully to see what happens now as we emerge from the pandemic, and so on. Again, I'm not going to go through every point. So let me finish with one broad observation, just connecting back to something I said toward the beginning. What I said was, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think it was fair to say that the focus of policymakers was on supporting demand, and that was really paramount. The considerations of demand. My sense is that as we've continued and are moving out of the pandemic, policymakers' focus has broadened, and so considerations of supply are much more present. And obviously, we saw that in the inflation data earlier today. Issues of the supply of labor, and I talked about participation and some of the obstacles affecting the labor supply. Of course, the pandemic. There's childcare. There's schools. There's lots of other issues. I think policymakers are focused on incentives, and we saw that in the discussions of the unemployment insurance provisions that expired earlier this fall. And in some sense, I think of the aperture of policymaking, and that connects, of course, to the long-term budget situation and debt and deficits. And just to finish in a traditional CBO way, the budget deficit was wide before the pandemic. and was projected to remain wide before the pandemic. And debt was rising and set to continue to rise into the future. Those challenges remain, and that ultimately will be a focus again of policymakers, that the long-term fiscal challenge is not immediate. And of course, there's policymakers have the ability to undertake additional fiscal policy to support the economy. And that's the work that CBO is doing now. But it would not be surprising if, in the future, policymaking thoughts return back to the long-term fiscal deficit, the long-term fiscal challenge. And of course, CBO will be there. We're ready to support policymakers and support the Congress wherever policy goes. So Mark, why don't I stop there, and I will stop my screen share, and I'm happy to take questions on any topic.
That's great, Phil. Thank you so much for those remarks. Really interesting. Maybe just to kick things off to get us started, you can walk through a little bit, just how is it? I'm such a huge fan of CBO, as I said in the intro, and really enjoyed the slides and your discussion over the last 20 or so minutes. Can you just talk a tiny bit about how it is that CBO decides to embark on the reports and analyses and estimates that it does? I think it's not just like, Phil, you wake up one day and say, oh, I'd really like to look at this thing. So you are Congressional Budget Office, you're sort of serving various people in Congress, but can you walk us through a little bit how that works?
Okay, sure. So, some of our reports are statutorily required, and this is the budget updates. Some are to support the sort of regular operations of the Congress, and we work very closely for the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate in what we think of as a scorekeeping function, to make sure that they have the data they need to to provide appropriations that run the federal government. And then for much of the legislation, we work for the chairs and the ranking members, so the top Democrat and the top Republican on the committees of jurisdiction. So first and foremost, we work for the budget committees. The CBO is, in some sense, reports through the budget committees, again, in the House and the Senate, and then the committees of jurisdiction on policy topics, so on healthcare. In the Senate, there's a help committee, health, education, labor and pension as the help committee, the Senate Finance Committee, in the House, similarly, energy and commerce and ways and means and others. So there's a variety of committees. We work generally with the chairs and ranking members as their staff develop legislation. An important part of the mission of CBO is to prepare to support the Congress. So our challenge is to think about where's the Congress going. We'll never tell them where they should go, right? We do positive analysis and not normative, but for us to be the most helpful for the Congress, we need to have the analysis ready to provide, to support them. And in some sense, we need to get there with our analysis before they're on the topic.
Great, thanks so much for that, Phil. So we've got a bunch of great questions coming in. I'm just going to ask a couple more, then I'm going to sort of bounce back and forth between questions from our audience and my own. And I encourage people who are in the audience to send in questions that you may have. But maybe you can talk a little bit. You touched on productivity. Economists are very concerned about productivity. We've obviously seen just a gigantic disruption in how people work today versus, let's say, 20 months ago. I think it was about 20 months, early mid-March, when things kind of shut down. So it's completely different. So many people working from home or hybrid or what have you. And obviously some sectors of the economy have shrunk, others have grown. Can you just talk a little bit about what we have people here who've done a little bit on like work from home, and is that good for productivity? But just as you look forward, given all of your knowledge and insights and from your team, how are you thinking about productivity going forward?
Okay, no, very good. And right, I mean, it's a key driver of the economy in the long term, and therefore a key driver of the fiscal situation. It's I was about to say fiendishly difficult to project productivity, which in some sense is experience the late 90s and the 2000s is the variation over time in productivity. Right now we see essentially a reversion in the productivity trend. So productivity was somewhat lower, over the past decade. So coming out of the financial crisis, productivity growth slowed, and then in the latter, sort of the couple years before the pandemic, productivity growth seemed to have accelerated somewhat as the economy reached and probably exceeded potential. And then with the pandemic, it's just really hard to say. So we, for now, we see a modest rebound of productivity above where it was during the period before the pandemic, but not, reaching the very strong productivity growth from, say the late 1990s. But that is, right, this is all the list. I won't go back to the slide I had before, but all the factors on the slide, participation and fertility, mortality, all of that will feed into productivity. Actually, just one more thing is that in addition, of course, to productivity, we look carefully at what's happening to the labor force, and the labor force is considerably lower now than it was, smaller now than before the pandemic. We're trying to figure out, well, will people come back? And then, of course, what will happen with immigration, right? Immigration fell considerably in the years before the pandemic, and then, through policy choices, and then during the pandemic, fell as well. And, some mix of documented and undocumented immigrants. We're looking ahead to try to figure out, well, what happens to the labor force? Because that also will be a key driver of GDP growth and then of the fiscal situation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So you mentioned a little bit deficits, which anyone who knows me well knows that I'm sad about the deficit situation in the US. I was before COVID. I am about it now. I think we've done a lot of great things to help families and individuals and firms and state and local governments and so forth with all of the various stimulus. And obviously you do a fair amount to project deficits going forward. CBO does, sort of what is the trajectory of the debt to GDP ratio going to be and so forth. And I think I just want to you're here, so I want to ask you, so it is a very different world today where deficits don't seem to be a concern. This was true 20 months ago. It was just not that big a concern on either side of the aisle. And, when I was in graduate school 25 years ago, people used to talk about the impact of deficits on interest rates, that they would tend to go up. But obviously we see interest rates at historically low levels. Can you just help us a little bit think about how CBO thinks about what's going to happen to the evolution of interest rates in the future? Because obviously now we're much more vulnerable to interest rate fluctuations than we would have been, let's say, 2, 5, or 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. No. You landed at the key point that the debt to GDP ratio has risen, but interest rates have remained low, and the low interest rates mean that the carrying cost of the debt, right, the net interest burden for any given level of debt is lower and lower as a share of GDP than it would be if interest rates are higher. The challenge is that the higher debt ratio, both this ratio to GDP and then also just the stock of debt in dollars, means that we're more vulnerable. Right? It's not that the debt is, it's not all short-term debt, but the duration of U.S. debt has come down, somewhat over the past couple of years, and that means that rising interest rates would translate into a rising net interest burden, rising higher carrying cost of the debt, so to speak, relatively quickly. And so that's the danger, is that the rising debt makes us more vulnerable to a change in circumstances that leads to higher interest rates. Now, of course, we can all understand that one such change of circumstances would be a happy thing, right? If the economy's growth accelerated and continued to be strong, well, that would lead to higher interest rates, and that's good, right? It's positive circumstances lead to higher interest rates. On the other hand, higher inflation ultimately over time will translate into at least higher nominal interest rates. And then of course the real interest rate would depend on, this is the gap between, inflation and the nominal rate. But that, in some sense, that is the danger. If the current constellation of supply challenges that are affecting the economy remain, then it says we could get continued challenges with growth at the same time as interest rates rise. And so that would be the difficult situation, because both the numerator of debt or of deficits and the denominator GDP would face some challenges. And so there's a certain nonlinearity that that could be involved, that we're at risk. And again, I'll just hasten to say, this is a risk, is looking forward. The current fiscal situation is such that policymakers have the ability to undertake further action if policymakers decide that that's advisable.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more slightly technical, slightly wonky question. Then I'm going to go to a bunch of audience questions, because we have some great ones. And it has to do with what we economists refer to as the term structure of the federal debt. Okay, so the government, let's say it's a bunch of debt is coming due. We got to roll it over. We've got to go out there and, let's say, get 300 billion or 500 billion or whatever the amount is. Do we do 30-year? Do we do 3 month? Do we do 10-year? Do we do 1 year? It isn't just the case that there's some person at Treasury who's just deciding, I feel like doing 3 months today. I feel like doing 30-year tomorrow, or is trying to optimize that. Are their hands pretty much tied with respect to how they roll over the debt? Because you talked about the duration of debt coming down, which suggests to me that there's a little bit of discretion. Because you could say right now, even though the 30-year rate is higher than the shorter maturity debt, that we maybe ought to lock in a lot at 30 years now if you're worried about this vulnerability. And so can you just, I've asked some pretty knowledgeable people about this in the past, and they have not seemed to know, but if there's anyone on the planet who I think might know, it's
Okay. No. Thank you. It's a great question, and it's a question I think that every incoming Treasury team and Treasury Secretary thinks about. And as you said, I was at the Treasury Department. I'm a Article 1 employee, work for the Congress. I don't think it's controversial to observe that we have one of the world's preeminent economists as our Treasury Secretary, and Secretary Yellen has a really superb team working with her at the Treasury. Past Treasury secretaries across administrations have come to the judgment that maintaining a stable Treasury market and having the composition of the Treasury market relatively stable, evolve very slowly, is for the benefit of the market. And as you said, of course, if interest rates remain low and if the yield curve is flat, well, then one can imagine saying, okay, let us as a nation lock in long-term rates and just issue 30-year debt. And obviously, again, this is not up to CBO. We project it, we track it. It matters to the budget deficit. And that is, but this is the Treasury's job, and that is a trade-off they face between these sort of pecuniary benefits or potential pecuniary benefits and the stability that benefits markets, and having markets the supply of treasuries, the composition of the supply is relatively predictable. Past Treasury secretaries have fallen in with the predictability. And of course, another obvious consideration is, well, how deep is a demand for 30-year securities? There's lots of reasons why there's been an increased demand for long-term assets over the past decades, from pensions and insurance companies and so on, foreign investors. It's ultimately a question of how deep that market is. And so, how much would a wholesale shift toward longer-term Treasury issuance, what would that mean for interest rates? But those are the sorts of considerations. And again, from the CBO perspective, we have to track it, we have to project it, because it matters to the budget deficit. But we don't have a normative view. We certainly don't tell one of the world's preeminent economists how she should do her job. We'll put it that way.
Okay, that's helpful. And she's actually going to be speaking at SIEPR in early 2022. So we're very excited. She's spoken at SIEPR in the past, but I'm sure she would appreciate that nice shout out from the CBO director. Okay, so I've got a bunch of questions about inflation from our audience. So let me just start with, we'll sort of build up. Inflation is very high right now, and many policymakers are pointing to this as a reason not to support Build Back Better. If it were enacted, how do you think Build Back Better would impact inflation?
No, it's a great question. It's something we thought about earlier in the summer with our analysis of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act,
IIJA, yes.
Everyone calls it the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. I think President Biden calls it the BIF. It's something we thought about then as well. And as a great question, as the questioner noted, inflation we saw in today's data is high. Real wages declined as a result, as even though nominal wage growth has picked up, inflation is outpacing real wage growth, which in some sense is the reverse of what we saw before the pandemic, right? Before the pandemic, we saw real wages rising, inflation was low, wage growth was accelerating. And what was especially, I think, noteworthy and I think is societal perspective welcome was that wage growth at the bottom of the income distribution especially had accelerated, that the strong economy before the pandemic had led in some sense to a spreading prosperity. Now obviously the situation again is the labor market appears to be pretty tight in some measures, and wages, nominal wages are rising, but inflation is outpacing nominal wages. Again, we have to project this because it matters for the federal budget. Inflation feeds into the federal budget in lots of different ways, both on the spending side and the revenue side. On the spending side, there's certain transfer payments and other payments that are indexed to inflation, and of course there's TIPS, there's Treasury inflation protected securities, so it matters for our Treasury bonds. And it's something we're trying to figure out now, that we understand inflation is elevated. We understand why the mix of demand and supply. And the question we are facing, like everyone else, is, well, how long will the current supply disruptions last? And the challenge is that there's not just one thing, right? As many people observe, there's the supply chain, there's the labor force, there's other continuing impacts of the pandemic, there's global trade, beyond the domestic supply chain issues like truck driving and ports. Look, the market mechanism works, and I think we're confident that these supply challenges will unwind over time. We're still trying to parse out over what duration, and then of course coming to the question, well, that's something else we do at CBO is we analyze legislation, and part of the analysis is over the timing of the outlays, right? So legislation will provide budgetary authority, and then we have to think about, well, if there's a certain amount of dollars that are, appropriated or provided for a certain activity, at what pace will those dollars spend out? And in some sense, the pace of the spending will then connect back to inflation. Now, with the earlier in the summer, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was enacted, was passed through the Senate. It recently, last week, passed through the House. Many of those dollars would spend out over time and not immediately. So even if the dollars were made available quickly, it would take some time. And there's a sense in which that's the nature of infrastructure investment, right? You can't build a road or bridge immediately. Even something like rural broadband, there's money for electric buses, electric charging stations, replacing lead pipes, and a variety of other activities. It just takes time to outlay those dollars, for the dollars to go out the door. And even as some of the dollars go from the federal government to state and local and tribal governments, it takes time for that to work through the system. So we're still analyzing the Build Back Better, but that is the key. That's one of the key aspects of what we're analyzing, is the pace at which the spending will occur, and then the impact on inflation. And just the last thought is, on our website, on cbo.gov, we've started to put out the cost estimates, the pieces of the cost estimate for Build Back Better. And so everyone watching can go and look at, that has a sequence of over 10 years of how those dollars spend out. And so everyone can form their own view, and we're still in the process of forming ours.
That's so great. And so I had not heard it referred to as the BIF before. So I'd learned something new every day. This is exciting on the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is great. And I actually tweeted about that a day or two ago that it was, or a few days ago, about it being exciting to see, you know, this bipartisan legislation getting passed. So on the infrastructure bill specifically, it obviously passed. I'm not sure if he's signed. The president has signed it yet. I believe he has, but it is.
I'm not sure. I don't think he signed it yet.
Okay, but it's ready for his signature. I know that CBO takes great care to think about the behavioral responses of workers, of employers, and so forth to government policies. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether and to what extent CBO thinks about the response of state and local governments to federal policies. And I mention this because in infrastructure, as you may know, as I think you know, state and local governments do a lot of infrastructure stuff as well. And so there's this thing that, you know, we sometimes worry about in economics or think about is crowd out. And, you know, the fact that the federal government is now doing more in this space, does it cause state and local governments to dial back a little bit their efforts, which would to some extent attenuate the impacts? Is that a margin that is on the radar screen of CBO, would you say?
It is, and it's something that the agency has done work on in the past, and that informed our analysis of the BIF. I want to see if I can make you smile, Mark, by saying the BIF again. So there, success. That this effect is exactly as you said, that when the federal government provides more resources for traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges, most of that work is actually done at the state level. So the money flows to state and local governments, and there is some offset, some crowd out. That is in our estimate. That's in our cost. That's in our estimate of the economic impacts of the BIF. It's not in our cost estimate. Like the cost to the federal government is whatever the cost is, right? Is as we had it in the cost estimate. We did an analysis published in early September of I'm sorry, in August rather, in analysis in August of an evaluation of the economic effects of infrastructure investment and then the effects on the federal budget, right? So infrastructure investment would boost productivity, that would boost GDP, higher GDP, higher incomes, and that in turn means increased revenues. So there's a feedback from from the spending to revenues. Now, of course, the spending doesn't pay for itself, just like tax cuts generally don't pay for themselves, right? The additional revenue doesn't fully offset the growth cost of the additional spending, but there is some feedback, and we did look at that. And so we published a report in August. It wasn't tuned exactly to the provisions of the BIF, but it was an illustrative example of infrastructure investment, and it had this characteristic that there's some offset when the federal government does more. There's less effort from the state and local government. Let me just mention quickly one other aspect of this. In the Build Back Better, which we're still analyzing, there's childcare provisions that essentially provide federal support for childcare, which again is as I said before, is an important aspect for both for many families, and then also looks to be important for what's happening with labor force participation, the labor supply. State governments have to choose whether to participate. So part of our analysis is to figure out under what circumstances will state governments and how many state governments will participate with the program depending on the different configurations of the program. And so that's where we're still analyzing that, but it's another aspect in which, as you said, the decisions undertaken by state and local governments feed back and affect the federal budget.
So I want to return to something that we had discussed a little bit earlier today, and that is at the Build Back Better, and this is often true with legislation. It's not unique to Build Back Better, but there are a number of provisions that they don't necessarily move in lockstep. Some provisions expire earlier than others, as called for in the legislation. And so one could want to know, suppose that those things didn't expire, which is to say, suppose it was the case that something that was expiring after 2 years or after 4 years or after 6 years, that that it was continued, and then what would the budgetary effects of that be? So my understanding is that CBO is going to try to embark on a, suppose we didn't have the expirations happening, what would then the budgetary and economic impacts be? Am I right about that?
Yeah, it's something that that we've done in the past, and I'm looking forward to doing again in the future. We call it the alternate fiscal scenario, and so that looks at expiring provisions and looks at, well, what would be the counterfactual fiscal situation if expiring provisions did not expire. The last one was actually done I guess it was before my time as director, and that looked at the effects of the 2017 Tax Act, right, which has a number of provisions that will lapse in after 2025. And it says, well, what's the fiscal situation if those continue? And one can imagine that the next version of this, so the alternate fiscal scenario, would do, excuse me, the same thing on the spending side as well. There's certain provisions that, under the legislation, lapse at a certain time, and it varies by provision, but one can imagine policymakers intend to make permanent, and so one could look at that, and at some point in the future, CBO certainly will. Obviously, we're sort of all hands on deck analyzing the legislation as it's written, and that's our first and foremost responsibility, is to evaluate the legislation as it's presented. So it's certainly a future activity, and of course, it's important to policymakers to think about the long-term fiscal situation. Maybe I should just mention really quickly, the analysis can get more complicated. There's other behavioral considerations. And so, for example, in the under current law, there's a certain expansion of healthcare provisions. Essentially, the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act are larger and it's just broader, I guess is the way to put it. And the Build Back Better proposal includes a further, further provisions on that. Is not permanent though, and so as those become permanent, we would have to think about how that starts affecting behavior in the healthcare system. How will employers respond in their decisions about whether to offer insurance coverage to employees as the subsidies available through the federal government increase? Now, there are other provisions, there's a so-called employer mandate that affect that decision. So there's lots of margins, and of course, health insurance is an important recruiting tool, and employees value the insurance coverage they receive through work. So there's lots of considerations, but that'd be one other example of the way that a policy that goes from temporary to permanent or longer lasting could affect behavior, and we'd have to think about that and ultimately how that affects the fiscal situation.
Super interesting. Thank you so much for that. I've got a bunch of questions. A bunch of people would like to know some variant of the question: why are there so many unfilled jobs across the country? So I can ask you. I have a data. So it's always interesting when you think about inferring what's happening in the economy from your own personal experience. But my middle school age daughter, there are no bus drivers now. So many of us parents, we've devised these complicated carpool arrangements because it's impossible to find bus drivers, apparently. So anyway, and you don't have to zoom in on bus drivers specifically, although I am curious about that market too. But why are there so many unfilled jobs? And it's sort of like in that general vein.
Yeah, it's something that we are analyzing as well. And as I said, that's an important part of the macro outlook. And the challenge, for all of us and for your, for middle school, is that there's not one aspect of the challenge here, right? The labor supply shortfall, in a sense, reflects just a variety of things. There's concerns about the pandemic, and hopefully those will diminish as vaccination broadens out, down to 5-year-olds, as boosters seem to become widely available. So there's pandemic concerns or health concerns. There's childcare concerns, and of course, one of the challenges that many people face is what's happening in schools and quarantines and so on. There's elder care responsibilities. this is a huge number of issues, and maybe there's a change in preferences that perhaps the experience of the pandemic just changed people's preferences about wanting to work or not wanting to work, wanting to stay home, to care for a child, care for parents, care for other loved ones. And that affects the labor supply. And then, of course, as I said before, there's been a change in immigration and sort of ability to enter the country. Seasonal workers are hit by that. And, of course, in California, seasonal workers are important in certain fields, in agriculture, for example. In tourist areas, seasonal workers are important in summer camps, things like that. So that's the challenge. There's a wide list of reasons, a long list of reasons behind the seeming mismatch between labor supply and labor demand. And so I do not have an answer for your middle school. I'll put it that way. I have a list of questions. I'm confident again that the economy will adjust, right? That wages will are adjusting and will adjust, and I suspect the labor supply will come back to some extent. How that shakes out, how long it shakes out, and takes to shake out, those are questions we're thinking about, but I don't have an answer for.
Okay, great. I've gotten so many great questions, so I apologize to those in the audience if I don't get to your question, because there's some great ones. And so I wish we had much more time, but what are you, just to come back to the debt, because it's clearly first order, what are the projected economic consequences of continued rising debt? And at what scale would the debt need to be reduced to mitigate those consequences?
No, very good. And just to start out from what I said before, right, the CBO provides analysis, but not opinion. So we do not have or put forward normative views. And so we provide policymakers with analysis of the considerations and the trade-offs. And as I said before, rising debt means increased vulnerability. It doesn't mean a crisis today, tomorrow, or anytime in our projections, but it means increased vulnerability to a problem. There's a sense where the CBO macro outlook is the conventional wisdom in a sense, and is not, that's not a pejorative, right? We aim to be in the middle of the distribution of, of views, and that's the conventional wisdom. Rising debt levels over time will mean higher interest rates, and that will feed back both directly to the budget through net interest outlays, through debt service, and also indirectly through effects on investment and consumption. And so there is an impact of higher interest rates and higher debt and higher interest rates that feeds back to the economy. Interest rates have remained low over the past several years for a variety of reasons. Domestic reasons, demand, increased demand for safe assets, increased demand for long-term assets, such as through pension funds, insurance funds, increased foreign demand for dollar assets and treasury securities, and so on. And so there's been a number of developments, all have gone in the same direction of keeping interest rates low. There's no guarantee that those developments will all continue. And so over time, rising debt will translate into higher interest rates. The CBO budget, the economic and budget projections have that. It's a very moderate. It's honestly a very moderate increase under our current budget outlook, and we're redoing that. We'll have an update either later this year, or more likely early next year, January, February next year. We'll update our projections and include any legislation, of course, that's enacted in the meantime. But the challenge is still there, right? The challenge of the deficit remains, and the debt trajectory ultimately is unsustainable. It's just not it's not such as a near-term issue necessarily.
Phil, thank you so much. I want to invite, if there are especially students, but also SIEPR supporters, faculty, and others in the audience who didn't get their question answered, feel free to kick me an email, and I'll try to pester Phil with it, because I'm going to talk with him a bit later. And in any case, I'm really so grateful to you, Phil, for making time today to meet with students, with faculty, to share your insights with our audience. I think the world, as you know, of CBO. I think the work that you're doing is so important to the country, and really thank you for your service. And on that same note, I do want to flag that tomorrow is Veterans Day here in the US. And I just want to thank, for those who are watching, who have served in our military, I want to thank them for their service, on this important holiday. And, with that, Phil, I hope that we'll be able to welcome you back again soon. And it is, and really so appreciate any parting words that you would like to share with on any dimension.
No, I just say, thank you again for having me, and it is really a pleasure. And we are continuing to work. We'll have more analysis of the Build Back Better Act. Obviously not tomorrow on the federal holiday, but I'm hoping on Friday and then into next week we'll continue to provide our analysis as the Congress continues to consider the legislation.
Well, thank you so much again, Phil. Thank you for your service. Thank you for making time. And for those of you in our audience, thanks for tuning in. And more exciting SIEPR events on the horizon that you'll be hearing about. And we always welcome your suggestions and hope to see you again soon. And thanks, everyone. Best wishes for the rest of your week. Okay, bye-bye.